in 2017, we had a thing in Cape Town called Day Zero, where they gave us something like a week left of water, and then the water would be finished, and then there would be no more water coming into our cities, into Cape Town specifically, because there just was no more water left. And I kind of diverse a little bit, but I think it's such a beautiful story. What happened is the week before Day Zero was going to happen, the farmers living further up, and still in the Cape kind of area, but further up, have their own dams. And in this kind of gesture of kindness, they opened up their dams to feed into the dams of Cape Town in this kind of way, which was, yes, we don't know how we're going to water our crops or what we're going to do, but the city needs this and the people of Cape Town need this. And so we're going to take this leap of faith and we are going to share our water with them. And literally the next day it started raining and the drought broke. And I can't get rid of these ideas of connection and poetry and whatever in my work, because it's kind of, yes, we all have rain, but we all have different rain. And it's the stories that I'm interested in.
Hey everyone, just a quick heads up. We were experiencing some technical difficulties with this video feed during this episode, so the visuals might come through a bit choppy on my end. However, Vanessa actually looks great in the show, and the screen sharing portion is actually pretty good, but my feed looks a little bit choppy. So don't worry though, the audio is crystal clear, and the conversation was just way too good not to share. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this great discussion with Vanessa Cowling, and thanks for tuning in. Welcome to the show, Vanessa.
Thank you, Patrick. It's lovely to be here.
I'm so glad to have you on. Yeah, I'm so glad to have you on. I've been looking forward to this episode. Steve has discussed your work, and I'm just really excited to kind of dive into your world. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me. It's wonderful.
So just to begin, let's dive a little bit into your background and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Okay, so I'm an artist and a mother living in Cape Town, South Africa, who recently went back to study at the age of 47. So although I've been working as an artist since I graduated many years ago, I've kind of re-delved into various processes lately, which I think is what has led me to being here with you. But I'm a South African girl, grew up in the Eastern Cape, went to school here, lived through apartheid, went to New York when I finished school, on and off for 7 years. I've lived in Edinburgh in Scotland, so I've lived and traveled all over the world, but came back to South Africa very importantly because this is where I wanted to settle, raise a family, live, make art. And that's where I am. That's
awesome. I'm kind of curious. It's like did you study photography in your first BA? Was it photography?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I did an undergrad fine art degree with a photography major and English major as well. And I finished that in 1998, so quite a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of curious, like, what got you into art? Were you always a photographer? Tell me a little bit about that story and how you kind of made your way.
I think I've always had an artistic, being kind of interested in art. It was always a cathartic means for me to kind of express emotion, or just whenever I'd make something, it just makes me feel better. And I went into, I first actually did a science degree. I went after school and I did physics, chemistry, applied maths, and all these things. And my mother said I was awful. And and so when I was away working in New York for 3 months, she applied to art school for me. And she said, because otherwise I was just going to be a nightmare person. And actually that was my calling. And so she applied to art school for me, and then I changed. And it was only then in my second year that you have to choose a medium to focus on. And I chose photography. And I chose photography because I wanted to be in the world. I wanted to be outside, not always just in a studio space. I enjoyed experiencing other people. I experienced being out in the world. I experienced, having adventures and going to interesting places and still making. And I think that's why photography appealed to me.
I think that's really interesting that your mom signed you up for art. That's usually not what people do, like, especially parents. Most of the stories that I've ever heard, they were like, "You're going to be a photographer? You want to do art?" But she was like, "No, you're going to do art school." Like, do you? Give me a little insight into that. What was her reasoning? Did she already know you were artistic in that sense, or was she just shooting in the dark a little bit?
No, I at school, I don't know what the systems are like in other countries, but in South Africa, you choose 6 subjects as your final matric year. Art was one of them, but then I also did the sciences. And here there's this kind of preconception that if you do well or if you're smart, you do science, and if you're stupid, you do art, which is, of course, ridiculous.
I think so too.
And I think in my immaturity, I was kind of following the norm, but it wasn't really my heart. And subsequent to that, I've met the smartest people I've ever met in my life. But I think the important thing about my parents, which I was incredibly lucky about, is that they were supportive and they completely trusted myself and my siblings, and they believed in us. And I think there's a lot of freedom in that, having people support you and believe in you. And actually, both my parents are integral to my art practice and the kinds of stories that I tell, that kind of level of connectedness and support. So they both play a very important role in the work that I make still today. Yeah.
That's amazing. So let me ask you this. So you were doing well in those art classes, it sounds like, right?
Yeah.
And you also had the sciences kind of going for you. Do you have an interest in science at all, or what kind of science was? Yeah.
Funny you should ask, because recently, having gone back to do my master's later, there was talk, people going, "Oh, you should do a PhD," because the research, that I'm doing, I think is quite innovative. And recently I've been thinking, if I go back to study anything else, I wouldn't mind studying botany, which I did in my first year at university. And because I am interested in the kind of cross-pollination of arts and sciences. But I like the freedom. I like the freedom that art gives me, because I can be playful without having to be rigorous in that kind of scientific way. And I think it was that level of scientific rigor, which is very important, and I get it. But for an artist, I think it was incredibly stifling. But I do see ways of kind of how science can inform art, especially when, like in my art, I'm working with environmental concerns and those kinds of impacts that chemistry and photography have on the environment. So I'm interested in that. I'm interested in somebody helping me figure out how bad, is the runoff from washing my prints actually, and how does the soil deal with it, and all of those. So I think science can really inform different parts of artistic practice, particularly mine.
I would agree. I couldn't agree more. I believe it or not, I did something similar to you. I went back to school later. I had studied business.
Okay.
And it was another 12, 13 years before I actually went back to school. And I studied art. And I was, like you said, that's when the light bulbs went off, But I took a science class, and I crushed it. I did
Mm-hmm.
so good.
Mm-hmm.
But it was because it was my interest in art and photography,
Yes.
because I did geology, and
Okay.
I wanted to know what it was I was photographing when I was out in
Yes.
the world. And
Yes.
so then I got to understand monoliths and rocks and rock
Yes. Amazing.
formations and
Mm-hmm.
all of these different things I thought were really interesting, especially the types of minerals and the materials
Yes.
that actually were in the chemistry that
Yes.
actually made
Yes.
images. And so I was like,
Yeah.
okay, I made some connections, but I did so well because it was starting to connect. And
Yes.
so I think that is really, really interesting how the arts and the sciences, they feed each other. And
Yeah.
especially in your study, if you understand that. And
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious, is that what that connection you were starting to make? Was it similar to that?
I think the
To botany?
connections, it's not just to botany. I think what I'm looking for at the moment are connections to everything. I'm looking for
Yeah.
I'm looking for human connections. I'm looking for connections to incredibly deep evolution, like to the beginning of time, or like what happened before the Big Bang. And those,
Mm,
because I think those kinds of connections, it's like a micro macro thing. Like if we understand
totally.
something very small, then potentially we understand something incredibly big. And
Yeah.
if we understand those things, it's kind of our human connections become more important. It doesn't matter where I come from, where you come from. Um, it's our kind of respect for our environment, understanding that actually all of that comes from the same place and we have responsibilities. Um, so it's connections to science, absolutely, because I'm so fascinated by like what plants do and how they react. But I'm also
Yeah.
interested in the silver, and those different minerals embedded and metals embedded in.
Yeah.
So it's like the materiality of kind of everything and the vitality of everything. Really interests me. I get quite excited. Yeah.
Well, it shows up in the work when we get to look at it a little later. I think that's really quite fascinating, and I think you're nailing on something. I think which when you become curious, and I think that's what photography did for me, is I became curious about the world around me, and when you start seeing things show up in your images, it makes you ask questions and that investigative heart, that need to understand, or that need to kind of find some meaning is really, really interesting. And I loved what you said about that kind of the micro to the macro. And it is fascinating how some of these micro processes actually mimic these macro processes,
Yes.
and how they kind of feed all through that, and how you can see that repetition as you go through. And I think that is really, really interesting. So this is kind of a leads back to your evolution a little bit. What inspired you to go back to get an MFA?
Well, I was always making work and I was in like little group shows and things because my practice, as I said, it's cathartic. It's something I need to do. I need to make things all the
Yeah.
time. And
Yeah.
a very good friend of mine because I was always teaching at UCT as well as a part-time lecturer. And a colleague and very good friend of mine said to me, well, Vanessa, you're making this work anyway. You may as well get, the kind of educational credit for it because you're going to make the work anyway. So why don't you do this? And I was petrified, mostly because I hadn't written properly, for 20 years. And she really encouraged me. And I actually have her to thank. So because of her, Fair Josephine, who's a brilliant lecturer at UCT, I took the plunge and went back. And it was 1 year into COVID. And so, the world had kind of slowed down a bit and it seemed like the right time. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting. What did you find, I know when I went back to school later, that there was a difference in the way I studied. Did you find a difference when you went back?
Definitely. I mean, I was incredibly busy, but I worked incredibly hard because I've also found with older students, you really want to be there. you're really committed to the process, because there's a whole lot of other stuff going on. And I have 3 children. And so my time was really kind of once they had gone to school and then at pickup time. And luckily, my partner was incredibly supportive, so we could navigate that parenting together. But he took over a huge chunk of that as well. I was focusing on what I needed to focus on. But I think the hardest part for me initially to navigate was this kind of age thing, because I don't feel, well, I'm 50 now, I don't feel 50. I feel like, age is like a weird thing for me. And a lot of my fellow students, they could have been my children. They're 20, some of them I taught, previously. And so that was kind of a humbling thing to kind of go, I'm no longer the teacher. I'm with you on the same level, which was wonderful.
I'm on the journey with you.
I'm on the journey with you. And then with some of the people that were giving me feedback at the university, they were my colleagues. We'd worked together. And it was a wonderful, I don't even want to say it was humbling. It wasn't humbling, because it was just so generous to be given the kind of kindness and feedback and support, really, from people who really just wanted me to succeed. So I felt incredibly supported going back as an older, student.
Yeah, that is an interesting dynamic to play when you are a little older. You're like, you could be my kid. Which is, it is a fascinating place to be in. But, I noticed that, when you do make that decision a little later, your commitment to the process is there.
Yeah.
And did you, how old are your kids? Are they, were they age to help you along in this, or were they?
Well, my little one, so I've got a 16-year-old, a 13-year-old now currently, and a little boy who's just turned 8. And he often, especially the little one, collects things that have fallen for me all the time. So,
that's awesome.
Plants that have fallen, and he'll go, this one, mommy, this one looks like a good one. Don't you want to make art with it? So he's the older ones kind of like watch from the sidelines, and often I'm busy doing things. They're very slow processes. So it happens in our daily lives, all the time. Things are constantly happening.
Do any of them have the desire to do the same thing, follow in the footsteps?
My son is incredibly, and I know he's my child, but he's incredibly talented, but he's also of that age where doing anything like your parent or your mother is just so not cool. And so
they get out of it eventually.
I don't know. So he's definitely steering more towards the sciences, but he's very interested in plants and biology, and it's his, he's following his own thing, and we'll see with the others. I'm not sure. I think everybody has their own, I wonder if for one of them, if I decided, they made the wrong decision, would I step in like my mother stepped in? I think there's a difference. I would have to try, like my mom, not to be forceful. There was just a way, like a gentle way. So I think, I'll try and do that.
Who knows? Your kid, and you know what to do for them in some ways, but I think that's really, really interesting. I'm always curious, if the kids follow in the footsteps or not, because I definitely did not. I'm the artistic one in my family, and I'm the one that decided to go that route. And so I'm doing things that are completely out of context for them, and I'm teaching them more than they're teaching me. And so I'm always curious if there is a follow in the footsteps, because sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, and you said it's cathartic. It's something you have to do. So it's been a part of their life forever. Yeah. So I'm always curious about that, but
we'll see how they, I mean, they definitely, if you could see on the other sides of my walls, I've got all the children's drawings and and things like that. And I'm definitely a fan of the work that they make. We'll see. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think it's an incredible blessing to have a photographer parent, because you get great shots of your childhood, and so and you have this great body of work that follows it. But I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm kind of curious of your inspirations. Do you have anybody that you like as far as artists go, or is there anybody that particularly inspires you? I'm a little curious about that.
So within a global context, Julia Margaret Cameron, I think she's amazing, on so many levels. I like that she only started making images when she was 54. So obviously that kind of age inspiration for me is amazing. And I love the kind of poetry of those constructed images that she was making really early on. I'm a huge fan of Sally Mann. I mean, the kind of cross everything that she's ever made, and her philosophies, and huge fan. I love the kind of real integration, or the embodiment of her life, and how that crosses over into the images that she makes. And I think that kind of embodiment, I think is important, because I think it's authentic. And then locally, I think that the global South, everything that I was taught in my undergrad, we always looked to the global North for inspiration, but within a South African context, within an African context, there's such amazing work that hasn't been as yet seen. And so that is amazing for me. So like my colleagues, Sphere Josephie, Jean Brandrett, amazing female women activists, artists, making the most poetic and beautiful work. So there are lots of local friends and colleagues that inspire me enormously. Yeah.
Was there anybody that was and maybe not necessarily an artist per se, but that was meaningful for your development? Anybody that came along? I always find this in almost every story, that I talk with, or anybody's backstory. There's this one particular person, or a group of people, or an artist, or someone that just made something click for them and helped them along their way. Was there anybody like that in your?
Well, obviously my parents, but I had an art teacher at school. We had moved from the Eastern Cape to the Western Cape when I was 13, 14. And it was really hard as a teenager. All my friends I'd kind of left behind, and I wasn't particularly loving school except for art. I had a brilliant art teacher, Barbara Ennis, and she was, and I think if I hadn't changed, and, you go back and look, if I hadn't changed school, I probably wouldn't have done art, so I kind of see the bigger picture looking back and going, oh, thank goodness I moved, because otherwise I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. And then definitely my friend and colleague, Sphere Josephie, who's a lecturer in photography at UCT, who's the one who said, you must, I know you're afraid, but you need to come and do this MFA. And that's really, really, to kind of delve into a topic and have such amazing support. I would have to say it's because of her. Yeah.
That's amazing. I love that. And what's interesting about doing the MFA is, did you do it? Was it a cohort, like a group of people that went through the program together, or was it like?
Yes.
Yeah.
So they were 10 of us, I think 10 of us, or 12, something.
And you all kind of did that program together. I think, those relationships are so important. That connecting group, that constant feedback from a group and watching other people develop is an extremely valuable process, just period. I think it other than, developing your own work and developing your own voice, which is what you're going there for, but those relationships, having that kind of feedback on a regular basis, that confidence that comes out of that, being able to speak is such a valuable valuable thing. But I don't think you need it in order to be an artist, but it's so important. I think it's such a great thing to do, just as someone that makes work. I know I benefited from it immensely, but go ahead. You were going to throw something
No,
in there?
I was going to say, in fact, we have a WhatsApp group still. I mean, even though we all finished 2 years ago, we still have a WhatsApp group, and there was a message out yesterday, oh, let's all go for dinner. We need to help, talking about our work and our practice. And so it's a wonderful community. But I think the thing that's also interesting about this community, which may be different with other MFA programs, is that they're cross-disciplinary. So it's not just photography. So there are people working in installation, performance, painting. In fact, I think in my group, there were 3 people working with light. And so I use that, working with light photography. And the rest were working, or 4, something like that, but cross-disciplinary. And in fact, my other co-supervisor was a painter. So it's interesting to have different perspectives, because for me, certainly, like, I have lived a life in photography. I understand, I think, light and different cameras and chemistry and all those kinds of things. But to have someone else come in who is not familiar with photography language and to start questioning the fundamentals of why are you doing this and what is that, for things that you've taken for granted, I think that's invaluable. Having a completely different perspective from someone outside of photography, I think, is great.
That is really interesting. That is really, really interesting. Well, and to have cross-disciplinary, because I think that's really interesting. But, the painting connection, I've talked to quite a few photographers that started out as painters first and then started doing photography and kind of work the edges of both. And I think an image maker is an image maker, what tool they use is, I don't know. It just differs, in different ways. And so I think that's really, really interesting. I bet that was a very fruitful experience. I'm kind of envious. I'm like, maybe I should get another master's. I'm just kidding. I'm like, you might see me at UCT, it's University of Cape Town, right?
That's right.
UCT. Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to. Yeah. I'm like, wow, I got to check that one.
You should.
But no, yeah, you're like, come on,
come to Cape Town.
I think there you go. I would love to. I think I've heard so many great things about South Africa, and I've met some great people from South Africa. So I think it's definitely a destination I want to go to with my camera for sure. But I guess where I want to go next is we're kind of going down a little journey with you, how you got into photography. We're now in your MFA, and now I'm kind of curious about the topics and the ideas you find yourself drawn to. So talk to me a little bit about what inspires you to make. What are you interested in? What kind of ideas are you kind of expanding on and looking at?
I think if I kind of look back at all the different bodies of work that I've made and I continue to make, I'm really looking for connections. Currently, when I also look back, everything is this kind of embodied experience, because I feel I'm trying to make sense of myself and my place in the world and how I connect to other people and how I connect to the world, which I think is, a common thread. And that in the MFA project and what I'm continuing to work with at the moment is how I relate in a more conscientious and empathetic way to the environment that I inhabit. So looking at photography specifically and more kind of awarely, like the choices that I make, how does that impact the world that I live in? So to actually start looking at the medium that you love, photography, and kind of acknowledging that it has an environmentally destructive history, but so, okay, I can accept that And now how can I move gently with that knowledge? How can I try and make changes in the way that I'm working and how I teach in order to not lose that medium forever, but work in a way where I'm not making things more harmful. Yeah, I'm not sure. So that's kind of where I am at the moment. And then using and working with these different mediums in a way which I think is kind of more sustainable. And then how thematically does that enter into the work? So it's not just an environmental project, but it's also projects about things that I think connect me as a human to other humans. So ideas of grief, mortality, memory, life, death, these kinds of different cycles, which I think are kind of big stories, how that then enters into the medium of photography itself, which is so magical and so essential, so we spoke about, why photography and not painting, because painting, you use light, you work with light, which is kind of the essence of life on our planet. And for me, that is so magical. Even painting, we see painting because light reflects off different surfaces, so for me, it's the most essential medium to work with when I'm dealing with issues about life, death, those kinds of cycles.
They do call photography light painting. Some people say that, light painting, painting with light or whatever. I think there's an actual technique called light painting, which I'm not making the connection. But before that, that's what some people were saying, in some of the early writings about photography, which I think is really quite interesting. Now, like you kind of did, I'm kind of curious about you've been working for a while, you've had the art degree before, and has your ideas kind of evolved? Talk to me about that early work, and because we're going to look at one series that I think is before your MFA. Yeah. And then you found this project that was during the MFA. So talk to me a little bit about that early work and how that kind of, because we're going to look at a series that looks at the coastline, and I'm kind of curious about that idea and how it kind of evolved into what you do today.
Okay. So actually, there's also work that predates that, which I haven't put up on my website yet, which I will. But I think it's important to mention because so I did a work before Shoreline called the Mending Series. And the Mending Series, which was my undergrad work, I took a whole lot of fruit and vegetables and chopped them up and sewed them back together. And over a period of a couple of months, I allowed them to degrade and rot. And then photographed them on medium format film, and then printed them out, and then I stitched into them. And it was called the Mending Series because I was trying to fix these things and kind of undo time, but realized through the process of time, they became something else. They became like these landscapes and these aerial photographs, and they just became something totally different. And I realized the kind of futility of trying to fix something or undo something which couldn't be undone. So that work was very important. But it was also kind of, when I looked at the images where I understood what they meant, I was kind of tired of this, I wouldn't say morbid, but yes, the message was very clear, but this kind of idea of beauty and joy for me became the kind of catharsism or the mending, or kind of looking for something that would not just accept this futility of trying to fix, but actually starting to look at moments in time that were beautiful. And instead of looking at things all the time that made me sad or made me confront death, was to kind of look at the sweet moments in between. And I think that's where Shoreline came from. It came from this desire to find peaceful moments outside and in nature, and in that kind of small, brief moment to kind of find peace. And that's where Shoreline came from that desire. It was also a place of experiencing different times of the day, specifically at the ocean, really early in the morning before the sun came out. And that kind of sense of meditation, watching the sun come up, listening to the water, and then the moments in between that incorporated the people and beachgoers in this very kind of painterling way, looking at moments of joy and kind of understanding the complexity of that, because not everybody, particularly within a South African context, has always had access to those kinds of spaces. So it's not just this kind of blanketing. I think there are these nuances, I hope, within the work. Yeah.
What's one of my favorite times at the beach is that time that right before the sun comes up. There's a eerie stillness. How can a shoreline be still, but it feels that way, you know? It's one of my favorite times. And I photograph it a lot, but I can't help but make a pretty photo, you know, and which disappoints me. You know, I don't know why. I find that, you know, I always photograph in a beautiful way, which especially the shoreline. And so I found your work quite interesting. There are beautiful moments, but there's also that nuance that you talk about. And I was really curious about that. And so we're about to jump into that here in a minute, which is, go ahead. Is your headphones okay? Yeah. So we're about to jump into that in a little bit. And then we're going to kind of jump into that work that you did in your MFA, which has kind of grown and evolved. And I'm really excited to see that, because you recently had a show on that, in that, and that's kind of how I found out about you, is through Steve. And so I'm really excited to look at that. So let's go ahead and jump in to that Shoreline project, and let's kind of talk through some of those images. And I'm excited to take a look.
So the body of work at Shoreline kind of deals with this liminal space between land and the sea. And it moves between these very serene kinds of spaces. I photograph in a way with very long time exposures. And I suppose the result is quite painterly, although I'm not trying to be a painter. But I am looking for these moments, almost like this kind of, when I look at these images and I remember these times, it's kind of like I remember the way I breathed in time to the kind of motion of the waves lapping. So I was looking very specifically for that kind of feeling. So there's this idea of, you know, the horizon line, the kind of calmness that I was looking for. And these were very large prints, 120 centimeters across. And they existed in combination with images like this. This is a self-portrait, so where I kind of immersed myself in the space. One of my earliest childhood memories is of nearly drowning. And so kind of for me to kind of confront my fear and to kind of enter the space that I'm photographing was very important. So that's where this image comes from. And then the work also came from a place of, you know, once I had children, I couldn't move around except when I went quietly to the beach by myself to make those very large landscapes. But the rest of my time, I was kind of with my children or moving around. And so I started photographing on my iPhone and intentionally starting to break down the surfaces. And the idea here was trying to not destabilize the idea of what people considered a good photograph to be, but to get away from this, from the technical, from this idea that in order for something to be a good photograph, it had to be taken with a particular camera, with a particular lens, with a particular format. And so I was kind of trying to break those rules and move more into an idea of kind of impressionism. So getting not a particular moment at a particular time, but an overall feeling.
I see that. Yeah, I get that right away.
And so there's a difference you can see when you look at the entire body of work. There are these cooler blue works, and those were made in South Africa, where our oceans are cold. We're on the Atlantic side, like really freezing water. And then I actually started making the work when my sister gifted me a trip with her to Spain. And we took a train from Barcelona up the coast, and I photographed out of the windows of the train, and kind of then went back and found these beautiful moments that were quite fleeting at the time, but then in the looking back and composing, came up with these types of images that are not specific people, but overall feelings. And these were printed quite large at 60 by 60. So the surfaces totally break down and they become impressions of beautiful days, at the beach. And in some of the works, you can see the reflections of the train windows, which I left in. And then the thing that makes them, you can realize they're not old because they have this kind of almost old Polaroid feel to them, is that you notice mostly the men, I'd like to say, on cell phones in lots of the pictures.
Well, it dates it for sure. Yeah.
And then you see these lovely moments of how, it's kind of like a Where's Wally painting. The longer you look at them, the more interesting they become for me, like the lovers and the beach and the people swimming and what's happening in the background. So there's this kind of immersive quality to them about me. And I'm definitely, this was the edge of the train window, but it feels like film sprockets to me. So they are very, I guess, painterly, but not intentionally at all wanting to be a painting. They really want to be this kind of impressionistic photograph, and quite playful. I love the banana, and then these, just like looking at what all these people are kind of doing in these spaces. And so this exhibition kind of played and moved between these kinds of painterly beach scenes, and then moved into these larger, I suppose, more kind of sublime seascape. So kind of, the safety of the shore, and then what lies beyond the horizon. So that's what happened, in these images. This work is actually a still from a video piece that I made, and I think this is an important work. The video piece was called Salt, and the corresponding image, this image is called Still, and it's the only seascape which I feel is turbulent. And in the sound piece, there's this kind of the motion of the ocean kind of moving and shifting, and it feels almost womb-like, these kinds of sounds. And this is the not the discrepancies, but maybe the ambiguity that I was speaking about earlier, because salt, could be tears. It's obviously salt water. It starts referencing that the sea is not this place of sanctity or safety for everyone, that people drown, people have had to cross oceans. It's complex. It's complicated. But I think if I look into the work and how my work has evolved, this kind of consideration that on Earth specifically, life as we know it began in the oceans, and how that changed, and how these kinds of salt bodies are actually part of us and part of plants and part of everything, is interesting. So I think this is quite an interesting and important work. And then back to the semi-calmness of how these things become.
I see the impressionist in there, and like when you look at those, you shoot, I don't see a lot of close-ups, and so you're seeing these like wides, and so the figures in your images, especially the human figures, almost become little specks, and then the umbrellas kind of create these little color fields that speckle throughout, and I can see that throughout the work, and I think it's interesting. It's I'm seeing a very poetic you've brought this up about people you inspire, that inspire you, that work in a poetic way. Do you try to work in a poetic way? If I were to look at this, do you hope I see the poetry in it? Or talk to me a little bit about that.
So poetry, I think, is a very important part of my process. I think I read quite a lot of poetry, and in my studio, you'll see a lot of poetry kind of in and amongst works. And I think it's just, I don't know that it's necessarily intentional, but I think it's part of just who I am. I think I just think I have that personality, or it's poetry kind of touches me in a particular way. And I think I do try and make images like that, whether I do it consciously or subconsciously, just because that's what I feel. Like this image, it's the rain over the ocean. And I love that. Like, I remember this moment. And as you know, being, working with cameras in this particular way, the way that you make an image can change how you read the image completely. Whether the horizon line is straight, how you've waited for the light, how you process the image. And I tend to, with these kinds of landscapes, I tend to use long lenses actually and compress space, because I like the kind of duality of flatness and space, at the same time. So I think poetry, I think it's just who I am. It just appeals to me. I don't think it's necessarily right or wrong. I think it's just part of my visual language.
I think that's interesting. And I read in this, the statement there, which, I don't, would you call it an artist statement or a piece about the work? But it was written, you said it was written by a student of yours, and they play with the dualities in that writing. You were talking about, I couldn't help but, as you speak about this and as you speak about your work, it seems that you play with duality, life and death, safe, unsafe. This, how important is duality? Are you using this to, number one, reflect on your position in the world, but are you, in a sense, thinking about this kind of thing, the duality of situations? Is that kind of an underlying theme in everything you do?
I think it's an interesting question, because I think dualities and binaries, and specifically, are so intrinsically caught up in the language of photography. So light and dark, I mean, that very obviously, that one. And I think, especially in a society at the moment where this idea of binary is being questioned, I find the language of these binaries that exist in my life and my work, in all of, I find it interesting. I don't think I intentionally seek out the binaries, but I think that they do exist. I think life, death, light, dark. But I suppose it's also realizing there are these kind of gray areas in between. And I'd like to think that my work and that I address those as well. So I kind of acknowledge the language of binary, but I'm hope that I'm trying to find the kind of subtleties in between those binaries, actually.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what you're doing. But you're hovering between, and I love the gray. I rarely stay on one particular side or the other of anything, but there's a.
Sorry, Patrick. Because I think between that binary of life and death, right, is the grayness of life, and which is not necessarily gray. And I think it is those. I think that's actually key, like kind of understanding that the binary are these extreme binaries, but that stuff is happening in the middle of that.
A lot of stuff is happening in the middle of that. A lot of stuff is happening in it. And that's what I think is so interesting about the time that we live in now. is that so many people have found one side of each one of these extremities, and they're placing their pole. You know what I mean? Well, you're this, you're that, and this need to kind of identify them in some weird way is so important. But I love this saying that people say. They look at a gravestone and they see the year you were born and the year you died, and they talk about that dash in between, and they said, well, the most important part is that dash. Live your dash, you know?
Oh,
and I love that. Yeah. And I loved that statement when I heard about it. And so I kind of see you kind of doing that, you know, in some ways, you know, but being where your feet are, experiencing this place, being willing to kind of experience that, that in-between space and I love liminal, because liminal is kind of a great word for that, I think. So anyway, we can kind of evolve next. We can move right into that next body of work where you were in the MFA work. So before we do jump into that, talk to me a little about what inspired that, where it came from, because you're no longer using a lens and a camera as in like traditional photography. It is a kind of photography when you start thinking about it. It was one of the earliest forms of photography. And so talk to me a little bit about that and your evolution into this work.
Okay. So I think evolution into the work is it's very important. So it wasn't like one day I decided I'm not going to work with cameras for this. And it's not to say that I'm never going to work with cameras again, because I know I will. But the work, I kind of needed that, and it needed this kind of haptic. What happened for me in this body of work, not working with cameras, is that I occupied space in a different way. And so instead of intently looking through a viewfinder at a particular vantage point or looking at a particular space, I kind of lived in the space. And that was quite a freeing experience for me. It was almost like I was inside the camera. And when this kind of work, which takes a very long time to make, and it's all about the world that we occupy, it seemed like an appropriate way of working. And there were so many different things that became important. It was my ability to engage, to touch, for the plants to touch, for me to touch the plants, for me to be involved, you know, kind of as this kind of shared agent in the making of these works together with all these other elements. So it felt appropriate for me to kind of be in a space where all the different elements were coming together to make the work. And I think it'll make more sense maybe once I show the work, because I'm sure that sounds a little bit out there. So I want is
no, it's okay. Yeah, let's go ahead and jump in. Let's take a look. Yeah, okay. Yeah, of course.
Okay. So how this began, this entire, and I think that it's important because now you're probably going, why am I looking at a garden? But the garden is an integral part to this body of work, and it actually it roots everything that I've made since 2021, including the work that we'll see later in Malouse and in town specifically. So in 2021, as part of a teaching module called Earth Politics, we couldn't go out. Earth Politics is a project that looks at kind of environmental sustainability. It looks at how we can work with ideas of the environment, of Earth politics, and how that kind of feeds into making work, photographic work specifically. And we used to do beach cleanups with students, and they used to collect things, and then they used to make images, and it's a very interesting project. But I found that it was really making the students very depressed, because when you start looking at these kinds of issues, it is depressing, because everything that we read is about, you know, if we don't do this and we don't do that, the earth is basically going to die, and we're going to die, and everyone's going to die. And it's a way, so planting this garden was a way to kind of try and bring hope to what seemed like a hopeless situation. And we couldn't go out in 2021 out into the world and collect things because of COVID. And making this garden, which is part of my research anyway, but involving the students, was a way to kind of ground them and to help in some ways to kind of connect them to a particular space. And so it started off as really it was a guerrilla garden. So we didn't ask permission from the university to do this. We just took this really horrible, bare, sun-drenched piece of land, and we turned the soil and got the students to plant, help to plant. Some of them had never planted anything before in their lives, so it was quite an experience for them. And that planting has evolved into various different stages. So the first group of students planted a piece in 2021. We planted phase 2 in 2022 and 2023, phase 3, etc. And then this year, we'll do another phase in August when I'm teaching this class again. So this garden is completely growing. It started off as a non-Indigenous garden, the global north, kind of what was out there, had all these different plants that we could use for emulsions, and we did that, but it didn't survive our harsh climate. Everything died. It was very depressing. My supervisor said, nothing is a failure, everything is learning. And so we planted an Indigenous garden. And so now we work with Indigenous plant chemistry and plants and students and growing. And so it's evolved in this particular way. And we work with the garden to make plant chemistry, photographic plant chemistry, which is non-toxic. So plant chemistry that can be used in the phytogram process, which is what I use a lot. But we're also developing recipes to process film and to work in the darkroom, in a traditional darkroom, to make paper developers from this natural vegetation called fynbos, which we have in the Cape. And this information is freely shared in various different workshops and, recipes that are being published through the Sustainable Photographic Garden. So it's a very nice place, and we do lots of different workshops in this environment. These are my Tierney Fellows from Johannesburg that I led in a workshop there. And then some of these images we're working, because water is a real problem in South Africa, we do the final washes of the prints in the garden itself so that the water can go back into the garden. And this is where I was talking about needing the kind of crossover into science to kind of investigate what are the implications of even of that little bit of runoff into the soil. So that's where I'm interested in the science part of it. But
what's fascinating about what you're doing there, that water thing is really, really interesting. You don't realize how much water is being used in the photographic process until you go into a dark room and hear that water running in the background.
Yes.
And and that is really, really interesting. The other thing, I'm sorry I stopped you.
Yeah.
But the other thing I think is really interesting is the indigenous planting idea. There's so much of this cross-pollination. I'm using that as a kind of a loose term here. That we're using non-local plants, because we like them as flowers or whatever. And you see that in so many gardens. But if they're not native there, they die, and they're not used to the soil. They're not used to the water or the sun. And I think that was really, really good idea. That's really, really smart. But then to use that in developing your own photographic processes, that's really, really interesting on itself. That is just fascinating. Was there, in this whole process, was there anything that you found that was interesting to learn? And maybe that's where you're going. As you keep going through this.
It's so, I know for me, it's so incredibly exciting, because as I'm working in this space and I'm teaching in this space, there is so much to learn. And so, for example, like here are different processes of how I'm working, with a particular garden. But what I realized now when I was in Malouse and Tarn is like the abundance of plant life, which is so different to the plant life that we have, and the abundance of water. It rained and rained and rained and rained. And I was like, I wish it would rain, where we are, because, for example, and it's a different way, and it's because of the different geographical situation, in which I live. But in 2017, we had a thing in Cape Town called Day Zero, where they gave us something like a week left of water, and then the water would be finished, and then there would be no more water coming into our cities, into Cape Town specifically, because there just was no more water left. And I kind of diverse a little bit, but I think it's such a beautiful story. What happened is the week before Day Zero was going to happen, the farmers living further up, and still in the Cape kind of area, but further up, have their own dams. And in this kind of gesture of kindness, they opened up their dams to feed into the dams of Cape Town in this kind of way, which was, yes, we don't know how we're going to water our crops or what we're going to do, but the city needs this and the people of Cape Town need this. And so we're going to take this leap of faith and we are going to share our water with them. And literally the next day it started raining and the drought broke. And I can't get rid of these ideas of connection and poetry and whatever in my work, because it's kind of, yes, we all have rain, but we all have different rain. And it's the stories that I'm interested in, like here, for example, in this work, which...
Wow. I am sorry, but that story is...
it's moving. I mean, literally, I went.
Well, wow. I remember a story, and I don't. There's this story of these kings that were in a desert, and they were struggling with water, and it's a biblical story, if I'm not mistaken. And they pray and they say, "We need water," and and they get instructions to dig your ditches. Yeah. And they're like, "But we're about to die here." You know what I mean? It's like, dig your ditches. And then they dig the ditches, and sure enough, they have all this rain, and it fills the ditches. And if they wouldn't have dug the ditches, it would have ran off. But it's one of those stories. It's one of those in real life. Oh my gosh,
literally it was, and for me, things like that really stick with me, and maybe it's just
how can they not,
But I was listening on the radio driving my kids to school, where these farmers, this farmer phoned in and said this, and it was just such a gesture, such a kind gesture. And for me, the gesture did lead, and I don't know how these things work, but for me, in my mind, it was that kind of broke whatever was going on. And it was scary. I mean, to be in a situation, and I don't know, and I've experienced one other drought before in South Africa. But I think this is the difference that I'm speaking about. When you live in a place where resources are incredibly precious, you can't, and so this is not a judgment at all. This is an understanding. I understand why I'm more conscientious and aware of water, because it is a limited resource. And that kind of awareness brings, a different kind of way of working with those materials, because they are more precious. And I think that then becomes potentially embodied in the work, this idea of the making of this work is precious. Yeah.
That is really, really interesting. It's that consciousness, I think that.
And so in this, sorry, Patrick, in this work, for example, here, this plant that was the only plant, it's a cosmos, which is not an indigenous plant, but it's the only plant that from the pre-indigenous garden survived, and it grew to be huge, taller than myself. And when it was, when I finally took it out of the earth, we sowed the seeds from the plant back into the soil, and then this work was made. And when it's finished, it goes back into the photographic compost that then eventually will go back into the garden. And it's this kind of respect, I think, that I'm trying to work with, not just taking things to make things with, but it's kind of being aware. I'm trying to be aware of everything that goes into making these works.
That's amazing.
So there's the compost that I'm talking about, that then also becomes another kind of work.
So talk to me about that compost. What do you like? You call it a photographic compost. Are you using this
Yes.
to
So
kind
here,
of create a light sensitive medium for you to capture an image?
yeah. So here,
How's that work?
so I work with it. It's actually a recipe originally from a person called Carl During, who I think did his PhD on this, developing this kind of plant chemistry. And so it's kind of just adapted a little bit from that. So these plants that I've worked with go back into this bucket of stuff. And the liquid itself, this kind of remnant that remains, still has the ability, in the presence of sunlight and light-sensitive photographic paper or film, to convert where it touches to silver metal. So that's what's happening. So in this way, in this kind of almost cosmic, loose, almost kind of Jackson Pollock-ish way, I'm kind of thinking about, in works like this, life and death, cosmology, origins, and I'm taking something which is considered to be dead and I'm making something else out of it. And so here you can see this is before the image is fixed. This is a big piece of photographic paper that I've kind of made this work onto, and here outside I'm fixing it. This is during COVID, which is why part of UCT we were we wore masks. So that's just to put that into context. But so that's what I was doing with this work, and I'm looking at keeping the remnants of these kind of photographic chemical processes. I kind of keep them and either then rework them, and then I'm waiting for my science buff to come and test it for me and tell me what's actually in there chemically, which is what I'd like to know.
And it's called a phytogram?
So yes, so what I'll show you, so for example, it led to this work. So these works, so that one and what you can see in the background over here is a phytogram, and phyto meaning plant and gram drawing, plant drawing. So it's a silver process, but instead of using photographic analog chemistry, which is commercially purchased, I'm making my own chemistry from plants and specifically from that garden. And you can use, and so then what I do is I work with old redundant film and paper that would normally go into the landfill, so it cannot be used as it was intended. So normally you would use it in a darkroom in a camera, but because it's been fogged and because it's very old, you can no longer use it. But because I'm developing selectively with the help of plants, I'm essentially bringing that old material back to life.
Upcycling in a way.
Yes, and working, and it's for me, it's the poetry then I suppose comes in again, because it feels like this kind of intention in this body of work called Fixing the Shadows. It's kind of fixing or bringing something back or trying to prevent death in a way.
Reminds me of the Peter Pan story, where he's chasing his shadow, trying to fix it.
Yes.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, that's what he's doing.
Yes, exactly.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And for me, the fixing the shadows is kind of multi-layered. It doesn't only refer back to that mending series where I was trying to fix and mend and to make something not broken. But I don't know if you remember in the very early, the beginning of photography, and I think Fox Talbot coined the phrase that what they were trying to do in photography, to make photography was to fix the shadows. That was a problem. The image would appear and it would be present, but because it wasn't properly fixed, the shadows would disappear first and the image would then disappear. So their entire task, the entire thing that they were trying to do to make photography permanent was to fix the shadows. And that term was then coined, at the beginning of the onset of photography. So it refers back to that kind of photographic history as well.
Yeah. It's, it's a great metaphor. I just love that metaphor.
And And it extends. I mean, I think I wrote, I don't know how many pages on this specifically in my thesis, but fixing also refers to mapping of the stars. So there's that connection to images that become, to that idea of mapping. Yeah. And so in works like this, for example, that entire evolution appeared in this very large phytogram, which is 5 meters by 1.5. And in this work, there's this kind of evolution, if you will, between things that are broken and dispersing, kind of like seeds, or like nebula, things that are kind of exploding and beginning. And it's made from live plants from the garden, but also from the compost. So there's this kind of idea of no beginning and no ending.
That's really, really interesting.
Yeah, and
it's I'm kind of curious about the so that's a long piece of cloth, correct?
It's a long piece of it's a long piece of photographic paper. So it's an old piece of no, it's a photographic piece. So in I want to say the olden days, like I'm so young, but in the past, when we, before digital, and we were people were printing large images onto photographic silver paper, and it used to come in rolls. And this is the remnant. So all of these papers, this paper, my amazing supervisor gave to me, it was fogged, so it couldn't be used in its traditional sense. And she gifted this roll to me. And it took, because there's only this one piece of paper, and because when you place something down, it becomes permanent. I had to kind of do a test first, and I had to wait for the light to be kind of slightly overcast so that it didn't, there was a lot of, like you see the result up on the wall, but it took an incredible amount of planning and awareness about sunlight. It's kind of like this dance that had to happen with watching the sun, putting something down, be careful not to like splatter everywhere. And if you splatter somewhere, splatter more somewhere else. It becomes this dance between the medium, the environment, and my body. If that makes sense.
Oh my gosh. Wow. And so you get one shot at this. And so did you do this all as one section, or did you unroll part by part and work on one section at a time?
I had my very nice friend, Satara Stodel, who's the technical assistant at UCT. She came and helped me, and we laid it out on my deck at home. Well, placed all the plants in kind of like paint trays underneath, and then gently unrolled the paper in section by section, placed the plants, put the glass, rolled out another section, placed the plants, placed the glass. And so we kind of moved along till we got to the end, and then watched, waited, had a bit of a panic attack. Is it ready? Is it too late? Is it too soon? Like this trace, and then
you really have no idea when you're doing it. Yeah. That's
and then rolled up and then straight into the fixative to fix, so that the changes then, wouldn't, it wouldn't change. But it was
is the fixer something that you made in your?
No. So the fixative is the only element which is still commercially, I still use the Ilford fixative, because I can't get any results, because fixing is so important to me and to my practice, that any other kind of fixative doesn't work. So what I do, it doesn't make the image permanent. Everything starts fading again after a while. People can use concentrated salts, but sodium thiosulfate is really the only thing in this process that works. You can make your own fixative, but essentially it's still the same thing. But what I do with my fixative is that I use it until it's exhausted. It then goes back into a drum, and then Cape Metal comes and recycles it for us. So they take it to their plant, and they take the silver out of it, and then they use that silver, to make other things with. So it's fully, we recycle it. I recycle it, and so does UCT. And we've started now also, my colleague is also getting another person who's actually a jeweler, who's actually going to recycle it for us and try to make silver nitrate that we can use in other processes again. So there is at least that. Yeah,
that's that is a fascinating. And so, and I'm sorry because I know this material quite well. So I'm like, what's the exposure time on this? You said it was long, but photo paper usually isn't.
So this process isn't that, I mean, compared to being in a dark room, it's long. But this process in total from the beginning to the end, depending on the sunlight, but this probably took 30 minutes. So it's long, okay. Relatively long, but it's not as long as, for example, if you look at works like this. So this was the garden that I was talking about. And in and amongst this work, which I see as a singular work, you have processes, the phytogram process that you can see with the dark works, which are the silver, that's actualized. And then you have anthotypes, which are made with plant emulsions over there. And then you have lumen prints, which are made just with photographic paper in the sun. And the lumen prints, depending on the season, can take up to 2 weeks to make, also depending on the paper, because that you're only working with light and with the plant, however the plant is kind of filtering the light. So that process is much longer. Anthotypes are much, much longer. So those can, that takes up to a couple of weeks as well. So it really is paper and environment dependent, but the phytograms are quicker because the sun, and you can watch it happening, the sun converts that liquid where it's touching into silver immediately, but you're waiting for a particular darkness, which is why you keep watching.
Yeah. So just for folks that may be just into the photographic process, you're talking about an anthotype. So give me a little brief kind of understanding of what an anthotype is, and the photo. You just kind of talk through the different versions you have in this image.
Okay, so within a
just real quick, you don't have to dive into
the lumen prints, phytograms, and anthotypes, and I've explained the anthotype and phytogram. An anthotype is a plant emulsion. So in an example like this, spinach, this is a spinach and nasturtium anthotype, and you take the plant body and you, I want to say zit it, that's a very South African thing to say, you pulp it, you make it, and you add, the recipe actually calls for alcohol, but in South Africa during lockdown, we weren't allowed to purchase alcohol. So I used hand sanitizer to make these. And I know,
creative. That's creative.
And so you get this liquid at the end, this kind of liquid that remains, and you paint the liquid onto paper, and then you put something on top, the negative, in my case, a plant leaf, and you expose it to sunlight. And where the sun exposes, it disappears and bleaches, and where it's shaded, the image remains. So that's what these are. And this is made with red dragon fruit. I've used beetroot in other ones. And these fade. So these, unlike the other works, which are fixed and more permanent, these, you can coat them with wax and you can spray them with a varnish, but over time they will disappear. So you can kind of extend their lifespan, but you can't. They will fade away. So
they'll eventually. There's something poetic about that, I would say.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. Does that play into?
So it's an interesting
that
thing.
idea.
Yeah. So for me, the idea of fixing is very important. And when I began, especially, I wanted everything to be permanent and to be fixed, only to realize that nothing is. So the anthotypes show that more quickly. The other prints, these are the ones within our lifetime are permanent. They're archival in terms of whatever you think archival to be. But really fixing is just a slowing down of time. So everything will eventually die, will eventually pass. And actually in the work in Tarn, which I'll show you later, that became very apparent, but I'll show you, we can talk about that maybe later. But the idea with
it's almost mosaic in a way. This kind of layout, and I think I've seen this kind of work before. It's so it's very, very common. as kind of like an early practice and stuff, but you're kind of doing this in an interesting way. It's kind of graphic in some ways, but it's also poetic. So kind of talk to me about when you put this all together and you laid this all out. What was the thing you were thinking about? What was the thing you were trying to convey? And talk to me a little bit about that.
It's definitely a site-specific work. So this was part of my MFA body of work, and it's rooted. So as you walked into the space, those first images that we saw, you walked in and the space was quite dark with the little light boxes. And then that one large work led you around the corner. And as you came around the corner, you entered into this voluminous space and you were confronted by this wall. And so the intention was that it almost made you go like, wow, because it's unexpected to see this incredibly large wall and this color, from this kind of monochromatic space. And that was the intention. The intention was to create a gasp, hopefully, and then this kind of, I don't want to use the word amazement, but like wonder, which then didn't make you think about all the deep, dark, sad things in the world, but just made you, kind of confronted with this idea of life and this idea of this garden. And the color emanations, were quite wondrous. And it was, so in constructing this, I was thinking about how the different colors work together. I was looking at some order and some kind of chaos. But it was really how everything fitted together. And it fitted together as this garden, but also as individual works. So that, like in a garden that we encounter in life, is that you see the garden, but then you have this time to kind of investigate each plant that makes up this garden. And that was also this kind of intention, that gardens are made up of individual parts as well. And so this work, began with these rooted images, and then moved into plant bodies. And as the works went higher up the wall, they started to break down almost as if they were seeding, but actually they were becoming nebula and different planets and suns. And so this kind of idea of life cycle was kind of embedded into this work. And it's,
you kind of, the individual, if you look at each individual one, there's almost this investigation, this serialness to it, this kind of, but then I just love how it all dances together. But I can't stop thinking about, you took something like nature and you flattened it and broke it down into a very simple way of, and I wouldn't say it's simple by no means. You don't look at this and think simple, but it's flattened, but you still achieve you walk into nature, there's an awe of the abundance of life. That's kind of the first thing you do when you walk into a garden or like a very voluminous place full of plants, and you've kind of flattened it, which is interesting, and only as photography can do. That's, we take these things and we flatten them and put them in boxes, and I think there's something very interesting about that. I
think that is, and that's why this work is an installation piece. So it's a space that you enter into. And you'll see with the work later, like I never thought of myself as becoming an installation artist. It was kind of quite intimidating for me. But the more that I work in this way, the more important for me, for this particular work, I think it's important. It was important to enter this space and to encounter that wall, which, yes, was flat, but which occupies a space which led you into it.
Exactly. There's so many it's, I'm giving you my perspective on it, which is probably not the original intention, but, I always think back to the art thing, the conundrum. As soon as you put it out into the world's going to interpret it, no matter what your intention.
And I think that's great.
Yeah. Which, It's a very interesting. It's just really, really. I think it's strong. It's very, very strong, and it's powerful. I wish I was this person standing there, immersing myself in it. And I think that's also, you had mentioned Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock has that exact same feeling too. When you see a Jackson Pollock, they're massive. And my favorite part of a Jackson Pollock is walking right up in it and looking at the individual details, but letting your entire periphery be filled with the canvas. And you've kind of created that here in this installation. And but it's also the same thing that happens when you walk into nature. And you fully immerse into a garden if it has depth, and it's not just a row in front of you. If you walk in, it fills your entire periphery. And it is very immersive, usually in a singular color of green, but there's lots of, if you go deeper, you can uncover so much more. So it's got this interesting duality. It flattens it in this way of photography, but it's also pulling nature back into you. It's interesting. I'm quite.
You'll see later how this garden, because you'll see how it changes, because the idea is that this work, I consider it to be a living work, and a work that will adapt and change. And you'll see how it adapts and changes to its new environment in Tarn, for example, and how it grows, and how some things are lost and how some things fall, which I also find, quite interesting.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, keep going as you wish. Yeah.
But so these are these kinds of, this is made up of those compost that become the roots and things like that, and all these weird, strange color emanations. And then images like this. So the one thing that made me sad about making a big installation like that is that a lot of the individual images are so beautiful, and sometimes the subtleties are lost, when you view it as a singular work. But the individual parts are also quite gentle sometimes, and quite beautiful. Like this, and each of these images, each of the works, I remember how they were made, where this plant was collected. So embedded in this garden are also all the kinds of memories for me, which connect me very personally to the work. So like this work, for example, I know it was winter because I left it out and it started raining. So this is actually all the rain that is seeped under. And at first I was like, oh no, that's terrible. And it was quite beautiful. Yeah. And when you walk close to my home on the mountain, which is part of the Cape Floristic Kingdom, which is one of the 7 floristic kingdoms of the world, but it's size-wise the smallest, but the most biodiverse, which makes it incredibly special. And botanists go crazy for it. But this is an invasive plant, and so there's a lot of cleanup that happens. So people go and they pull them out and they drop them on the side of the path. And so I would collect, the plants that were pulled out. And so that's where only the plants that are uprooted in images like this have been uprooted in some kind of, they've been found like that. Again, this is also on the mountain, different colors of paper that make these rooted images that then go into the different plant bodies. These are fading quite quickly, which is quite interesting. This is totally faded. It's in tarn, but it becomes quite bodily. So this idea, it's almost like a rib cage. I'm interested in that kind of plant-human connection, specifically because we can breathe because of plants and vice versa. And I don't think we think about that enough, this kind of almost internalization, like this embodiment of the plant as well. I find quite interesting.
Well, you had also, I couldn't help but think about, you said when you see the installation, you kind of lose these individual images, but isn't that our problem with nature in a lot of ways?
Yes.
Is that it's so immersive that we look at the whole thing. Yes. We don't necessarily individually pay attention to the individual things, and it disconnects us in a way,
So there's an author called Giovanni Aloy, and for the first time I heard him speak about this idea of plant blindness. And the whole idea is this kind of, I suppose, this human-centric, that we're so human-centric that we lose touch with anything else besides humans. But then I heard a botanist speak about plant blindness in the way that you've just described, which is this thing, we see the land or we see a garden and that's all that we see, and we forget and we don't look closely to realize that that garden or that piece of land or anything is made up of all this kind of biodiversity. And I think that's quite
individual parts. Yeah.
Exactly. And we're so big on that with humans. I'm an individual,
Yeah. We forget to do it.
We're the only ones that think that rule, doesn't apply to us.
Well, and you've created that conundrum in that installation, which is fascinating.
And then in these later images, I really start breaking down the surfaces, and I really start thinking not so much about grounding, but about source. And so I really start thinking about the silver embedded in this paper coming from the stars and coming from the first supernova explosions that created the Earth. And the poetry of that, this kind of connecting this deep, 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 deep past, this metal that's in this paper, and this idea of these kind of cosmological beginnings to the present. Like, I just love that. It feels like this kind of compression of space.
I really enjoy the fact that you think beyond just the. I like your micro to macro. I just think that takes this to another place, which I think is really, really interesting. So I continue. I want to give you enough time to see the rest of it. Yeah.
It's just because this was made out of this kind of alien moss growing in the Karoo. I think this is actually the only thing this is the dust from my house, the vacuum cleaner. But it is that kind of, I'm trying to understand the bigger picture through considering what is around me, because I think the clues to that must be around. Yeah. And then
that new telescope is producing images that you just saw, what we just looked at. And so these nebula and it's interesting. It really is. Continue, go on.
Yeah. And then these are very large works, not as big as that first work you saw earlier, but they kind of, this is that cosmos that really grew very large. I'm very attached to this particular image. All these images are singular images. So they're not like traditional photographic works that are made from negatives and then are reproduced. They're singular. And I think that gives it a certain kind of preciousness for me, but it also makes me like to some of the images more attached, because this plant, was grown from a tiny seedling that survived the drought. It grew to this massive thing. It was made for hours in the sun, where I kind of sat with it almost like in wake, with this body. There's this this very deep, this very personal kind of connection to some of these images, particularly that one for me. This one.
Is it strange to have kind of such a close connection to a plant? Like, does it have a, I don't know what I'm saying, is that like we have so many connections, we only think about the human one. And I don't like the way I said that question, but you know what I mean? Like,
I do. I think the more I work with these kinds of materials, and the more, there's an author called Jane Bennett who writes about vital materiality or vital materialism, something like that. But the premise is that when you start considering the liveliness of all materials, it almost has this political consequence that you become more aware in a good way of the things that you encounter and the things that you work with. And I don't know, it's specifically with plants. My mother has always looked after plants. They've always been things in our homes. They've always been things that you talk to help grow, that you look after. You know, I still got my grandmother's fern that I've become the custodian.
This goes back. Okay, so this goes back.
So it's
Okay.
not for me unfamiliar to become emotionally attached to plants at all, you know, and to kind of think about the caring of that. So yeah, not at all. This is that white work. This is the final rendition of that kind of almost Jackson Pollock-like work. And then a part that you haven't seen, there was another, and this is what made the installation kind of more installation-like. There was a darker room called what I refer to as the twilight room, which was much more darkened, where these individual images of plants made up this kind of almost memorial wall. And interestingly, I had some feedback from an astrophysicist at UCT, who then looked at this and he said, this totally looks like a star installation to me, because the blue ones are, I think, older and the red ones are newer. So he kind of saw it in this cosmology, you know, like the cosmos, and how the blue ones were older, you know, this kind of like thing, which I love, that kind of interpretation.
Yeah, I also like, believe it or not, the wires are working with it.
Yes, because it's not this.
It works. Yeah.
When the idea is that when you have walked into this room and you had to be careful. I mean, I don't think they'd allow us to do this in Europe. In Africa, they're much more. What's the word? They it's kind of like public safety. You know, it's not in consideration, but which worked for me. But the idea here was this kind of entanglement, this realness, you know, that there are things under the ground. It's not just the plants above. There's this whole kind of subterranean network of things going on. So I kind of wanted to draw attention to that. But I also wanted you to walk into the room and be careful. So I wanted that idea of care to translate. Be careful where you're stepping. Be careful where you're walking. Be aware. So that was the reasoning behind, you know, leaving.
Fascinating.
That. And then this work, you'll see how this work becomes a work that goes into the tarn work. But it began at the ceiling and it came down onto the ground. It's a big light, almost river, I guess, made from X-ray. So I collected these works from medical waste. I got them from a medical company that was going to throw them out, that were going to go into the landfill. And their X-rays used to diagnose human problems. And so I quite enjoyed that kind of translation into the human versus plant, you know, kind of embodiment of bodies, plant bodies and human bodies, and diagnostics. And then how the lights interacted was just fascinating, the things. So this was this kind of room. And then I made ambrotype light boxes, but processed in plant developer, that looked at the kind of stars. So that's quite long, but that's the beginning of fixing the shadows that is now extended into this other project in town, which is
Let's jump right in. We have about 20 minutes left. We have about 20 minutes left, so let's jump right in.
Okay, so the whole work with Tarn, curated by Steve Bisson, as you know, organized by Anne Neal, as part of the Venice Biennial, and it's conceived as a two-person show, if you will, which is why I'm starting with this work. So Terry Weitenbach, Steve curated with Terry this beautiful body of work that extends. You walk basically along the river, and everyone walks along the river. So it's kind of coming outside of the gallery space into nature. And these beautiful works interact with the landscape themselves, and then multiple different works, you know, which do this. I'm not sure if you've spoken to Terry yet, but it would be great because her work is amazing. But importantly, the reason I start with this is because it was a conversation between the two bodies of work. So when Steve proposed this work and mentioned Terry, I started thinking about the river specifically, and how two artists working in very different ways, what connected us, because this idea of connection was very, very important to me. So this idea of the river leading to the town hall was important in the way that I considered the space. And in a similar way to fixing the shadows as it was presented in Cape Town, I was now confronted with a different space. And the space was a space I had to imagine through videos they sent me. And I eventually made a scale model so that I could try and imagine and plan, for the space. And the biggest thing that Steve and I spoke about were the windows that transected this building at the bottom and then kind of went right up into the space. And he liked the idea of a public building and the idea of political transparency, but he really wanted me to play with this idea of transparency and working with light. And so I started playing with that idea, and I made 3 different windows that all connected in this kind of evolutionary story once again. This main big window, also made on redundant X-ray film, made with plant developer that actualizes the silver. And I created this fictitious horizon, which could also become a shoreline, and the blue sky could also be seen as water, I suppose, connecting to Terry's River, but more broadly connecting, the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, the sky that's above all of us. I was looking for these connections, and you can see the buildings in the background of Tarn kind of coming into the space as well. And it doesn't look that big here, but it's enormous. It's like 7 meters high into the sky. So it's really this massive, massive, massive window. And the bottom part of this land is made up also of the night sky. So these different landscapes within the landscape, but also the Milky Way. And here I'm thinking about your north is my south, or vice versa. So your night sky, when you're thinking about up, is actually down for me. So this idea of the global north versus the global south, like what is actually up and what is actually down, I think is important. As a global south artist, it was very important to me. But also thinking about the silver making up the land is actually the silver from the stars. So this kind of material conversation, once again, is very important. And you can see how that, I guess, translated into the bottom part of that work. Mm. And then it extends massively into this huge blue sky. And initially I was thinking, I want to bring Europe this big blue African sky, because that's kind of what we're known for, these big, abundant of space and abundant of blue. But I realized it became something more than that, and more than a particular reference to space, which was maybe the inspiration. It became more of this kind of unifying the sky above us all was my intention. And I think you can see a little bit here, all these different square and rectangular pieces that made up the sky that Jacques Herman helped me to install. He's a French painter, and I'm very grateful for the help. And then there were these other windows. So this was the one window, and then the other window, it started like that and moved across. And I was also thinking about how life on Earth began in water, and how we had to grow, and how plants had to grow a skin in order to exit the water. And so these plants, these kind of silver plants, become the land in the last image. So there's this kind of inversion of positive to negative space. And once again, I'm trying to understand life. I'm trying to understand and play with these beautiful ideas of how we got to be where we are, that there's this whole kind of evolution and the story, which I think is quite beautiful. And so as you look out through these window spaces, you see the town beyond it, but they also make these beautiful light reflections onto the ground. So the outside and inside space, that kind of space is blurred. And so the light plays a very, very, very important role in the making of this work, or how it interacts in the space. And in some ways it becomes almost like cathedral-like, like stained glass windows.
Exactly what I thought about.
Yeah, and it has that kind of, its intention in terms of the scale and size is to have that same kind of, I kind of want to use like the word sacred, but it's that feeling of walking into, even if you're not religious, of walking into a church, and just the scale and the size and the light kind of bring a reverence in a sense, and a consideration, different kind of consideration of things. And then as you look to, then as you look to this wall, some of the elements are the same, but this wall was much, much, much bigger. And so this garden space has now grown with 2 more years of work and spaces, and making more works, new works in different places, in different gardens. My mom's garden in Mauritius, where she's moved to, working with different fynbos to make up this garden that is essentially grown since the last garden. So with all these different pieces that now make up this new garden. And then this work, which is interesting, because once again, as you move up, everything that becomes more cosmological. And I love playing with different parts, where the flowers become the stars. And the scaffolding took an enormous amount of time to put up. And I had 5 days to put this work up. It was very, very high. And I had to kind of battle my fear of height, phobia, whatever that's called. And this work was right at the top. And we had a deadline. The scaffolding was being removed at 2:00 on Friday, and everything was up and the scaffolding went. And then this work fell from the top. And it landed at Steve's feet. Literally, it landed right in front of him. And he kind of picked it up and he joked and he said, "Oh, I think it wants to be mine." And I kind of went, I wasn't even really listening to him, because I was like, oh my God, everything's going to fall down. This whole work, nothing's going to stay up. It's going to fall down. And it was this very emotional thing. I kind of was like, Vanessa, don't cry. It's very unprofessional if you burst into tears in front of the curator you've only known for 5 days. And he could see that I was a bit upset, and he looked at me and he said, "But Vanessa, all flowers fall. That's what happens to flowers, and it's okay." And in that very moment, it was such a beautiful, poetic, but the awareness of why I make this work, in the simple act of the work falling down, everything came back. This work is about grief. It's about life cycles. It's about trying to make something permanent, which never can be. And that's how it is. It's okay. The stars will fall, the flowers will fall. And it was such a beautiful moment actually between Steve and I, because then I gifted him this work, and I said it was, it was meant, it fell at your feet, like literally. I mean, so there you go. This work is yours. And since then, I know other works have fallen and will continue to fall. And it makes me feel helpless and sad, and then people go and they care for it and they put some of the things back. But I know that it's not an installation that will stay up forever, and that's how life is. And so there's almost this kind of poetry and these falling works to the ground, which I've made.
Well, what I have to applaud you for is this this spirit of acceptance. Which is, I think, really, really important. And you came to it through the process of making it. And so I think that's interesting.
But I think that it's also the sign of a very good and empathetic curator, and so I do applaud Steve for that, because it was in his kind of generosity of kindness and spirit that I could come to that acceptance, as opposed to just living in the trauma, if you will.
Yeah. Well, that's also, it's like the power of connectedness and the power of others. You gave him a gift, but he also gave you one back.
Exactly.
my mentor talks about the law of reciprocity.
Exactly.
And and there is she calls it a law on purpose.
Yes.
And so I think that is really interesting, and you're like living it. So I think that's really interesting.
Whether I like it or not.
Well, she also tells me the universe will drag you kicking and screaming if it has to.
Exactly.
And so, yeah.
Exactly.
I was like, okay.
Yeah, but that idea of reciprocity is so important in my work. It's like Robin Wall Kimmerer, I think is the name, and writes about it in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And it is that reciprocity. You know, it's a reciprocity between myself and the plants, between the people who encounter, like with everything. I mean, it's a key idea, actually. And then just back to the process of how these works are made. These are the kinds of ways in which they're made outside, so not in a dark room, in the light in my garden with the water, in the desert, in the Tankwa. I went on an art residency, and this was a key place for me to have the quiet to really come to terms with the space. And you couldn't think of a space which is more different from this space to the place that I entered into at Tarn. I mean, they are worlds apart. And yet here, there was the quiet to kind of start making those windows and thinking about that space and why I was making it. And so they started off with small prototypes, you know, work that became a site-specific work, working with the X-rays, working with the plant chemistry and the sky. And it became a site-specific installation as the sun was coming up, and how this, as a friend on the residency called it, the sun box. So we sat around in this kind of meditative way and waited for the sun to come up. And as it came up and lit the work, it was very beautiful. It was a very lovely moment.
That's a great shot. That's a great shot. It can be its own image, you know, really, yeah, and that one too,
and how it changed, you know, but how it changed according to how, and the reason I show this, and from the other side, it became like a mirror, it reflected, and the reason I show this is because although it's a very different landscape, it's what inspired the work in Tarn, because I kept thinking about, and which it does in that space, that it constantly changes according to how the sun moves. And that's a key part to the work, that things are not fixed in that way, is that the work will be read and it will be experienced according to the season, the sun, whether it's rainy, whether it's sunny. And in that way, we remember one of the key essential parts of the making of the work, which is the sun. You know, it was important. And then this was the inspiration for including the Milky Way images into that work, was really in this darkness, really experiencing the night sky, and really experiencing darkness as the space between the stars, you know, which is, you don't get to see this in places with an enormous amount of light pollution. And that kind of expanse, something I hope everybody gets, you know, to experience.
Where you live, do you get to see the Milky Way? Can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And
that's amazing.
More so, I mean, this is just taken with my iPhone, this picture, you know, as the sun is about to come up in the east. And when I was going to install that work in the landscape, what I would do is, in this kind of darkness, I would walk to the space and place the work facing east, and then literally wait for that sun to kind of peep over those little mountains. I mean, that's what, and how the work was, you know, that's what inspired the work. So you can see the Milky Way when the moon isn't full from my house-ish, depending on whether we have load shedding or not. When we have load shedding, it's great because then there's no light pollution. But this is 2.5 hours outside of Cape Town, and then you see the Milky Way beautifully. It's magnificent. Yeah.
Yeah. It's an amazing thing to see if you can see it. So, And you're about to finish up here. So.
No. And then just what I would do at night on this art residency is outside my tent. This is outside my tent. I would fix the stars and make the imagine the Milky Way. So this is a piece of photographic paper, and I would use the fixative to look at the stars and then kind of imagine making those Milky Ways. And then as the light came up during the day, those fixed parts, would be transparent, which I would then develop in the plant chemistry to kind of make the darkness out of the plant chemistry, that's what I was thinking. And then just to show this is what the space then looked like before when I arrived in town, and how all these different people helped to set up this enormous scaffolding. Because I think often the reason I include this is often we see the final product and we don't realize that the work is actually almost like a performance piece. It's this attempt to fix something, to put something in the space, to make something. And that process is as important as the finished product, and as important as the product, or the images coming down. And that there were many people that helped me to do this, the amazing scaffolding guys from town. And this is Jacques, who's helping me to make the sky. And this is me trying to overcome my fear of getting right up there into this space.
I'd be like, it goes up there. It's up there. I wouldn't have gone up there. Yeah, nope.
It was, but part of me, like I had, it was like I had to, and it was incredibly scary, and it was fine. Maybe by day 4 did I start having vertigo dreams. And in the last little section where they had to turn the scaffolding kind of diagonally and there was much more of a drop, I did look at Jacques and I kind of said, please, will you help me with this part? And I kind of let go of that because and we had a little pulley. You can see the string here. There's a big string. We had a bucket. So they would put the works into a bucket for me and I would pull them up to the top or to the different levels. But
nope.
That's what Steve said as well.
Not for me.
Like, I'm not going out. Anyway.
I'll do the bottom part for you. That's what I'll do. Or and middle. I could probably go on it. Yeah. But,
the middle. That was even, that was also quite scary. But there was something quite amazing about overcoming that fear, which was also really empowering, So, yeah. And then when all of this was finished, part of my practice that's very important is kind of openly sharing the different environmental non-toxic practices. So we did a workshop in Mulhouse for the public, and whoever wanted to come came, and everyone learned how to make lumen prints and phytograms. And I can tell you the plants in France are, I don't know, they've got like superpowers compared to, the silvers, what I'm saying is that the developer was so incredibly strong. And I could notice the difference, actually, how much more potent it was. It was quite amazing working with different plants in a different environment. And that was just felt like I was living in a Manet painting. Fun. And I think, so that's, there's maybe other stuff to share, but that's the Mulhouse story.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love what I love about kind of listening to this whole thing is I like your curiosity, your adaptability, the poetry that you kind of bury into everything. It's almost as if you're going through a process and allowing it to change you, kind of thing, and you're adapting with it. Much like the plants, you've almost taken on the persona in a way of it. You know what I mean? And I love the adaptability. I love the challenging yourself in so many ways, and so it's really quite impressive. And congratulations on getting to put up the show and working and continuing to get the recognition. It's wonderful, and so it's great stuff. So I have to applaud you on that.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you very much. I think you're right. I am learning all the time and trying to adapt, and I certainly am curious.
Yeah. Well, and it comes through, and it also that same energy that is put into the making and the installation and stuff like that. I think, I don't know, and probably in an indirect way, the audience and the people that came to kind of see it probably had that same feeling. And so to be able to kind of translate that through your work and have the audience actually get that, that's what we all as artists want. You know what I mean? And you're doing it. And so I have to applaud you on that. So that's wonderful. I just have a few more questions. And so this first one is, what was the reception like? I'm sure you had an opening. Was it nice? Tell me what the reception was like. In what I just said, or I'm sure it was probably echoed, but I'm curious.
It was amazing. So we first had an official meeting with the mayor and all of those people, because it is a public space and it's very much connected to the town of Tarn itself. So there was the first, this kind of official opening, which felt really right, because in some ways Terry and I both echoed that this was almost a gift for the people of Tarn. So to kind of have this official, which also sounds kind of weird, because I'm this person from South Africa with a completely different landscape, and I'm coming to this foreign country in this tiny little town and kind of putting up this work. But what was amazing was that I think both Terry and I, this idea of connection and this idea of the space and that kind of connection, was very, very important. And then we walked along the river to Terry's thing, which is such a divine, different kind of experience to the gallery experience or museum experience, because you are actually in the space listening to the water, to the river, to the birds, the trees kind of like flopping over the artworks, an insect sitting on it. Like, is it part of the photograph? Is it an insect? That kind of thing was great.
It's a performance piece.
So totally. And so that was this lovely experience of walking. And then we walked then to this building, which is when you stand on the outside of the building. I wouldn't say it's a foreboding building, but it's very different to these very old buildings, the historic buildings that exist in town. So, it's very present. And then we entered into the space and nothing had fallen down yet, which was a huge relief, So I was like, oh, thank goodness. And people, and then we had this lovely translator, Elia, who, so that we could be very clearly understood, because most of the people were French, and being a South African, I don't speak French. And so it was beautiful to have that kind of conversation translated and understood, and you could see how important that was. And then we had this amazing conversation. Then we had like the vernissage discussion thing down the road. We kind of walked, and it literally looked like a manger in this medieval town. So we sat under what looked like a manger and had this discussion and then things afterwards. So it was wonderful. It was, and it couldn't be, so everything was, I wouldn't say contrary. It was different.
Complementary,
it was a different
maybe.
way. Exactly. And it was joyful. It was just because it felt appropriate, the different spaces and places and the engagements and conversations in that space were appropriate. And the nicest thing was that this old Frenchman came. Well, he wasn't that old, but, old. Anyway, I hope he doesn't think I think he's old. But this older person came up to me in my installation, and he couldn't speak a word of English, and he grabbed my hand and he said to me, I see the aura. And he said this to me. And then I looked at, and I understood exactly what he meant. It's like the plants in the lumen prints, it looks like an aura, because the way that the alchemy works, and especially with plants that still have chlorophyll in them, there's this kind of emanation out from the plants. And then he said to me, and I feel it in you too. And in this very kind of like broken, but we totally, what he was saying and what he was feeling, like we totally understood one another. And it was a very special moment for me, because I felt like even in this language barrier, it's something that we were speaking about earlier, even though we're speaking completely different language, I understood what he was trying to say. And I felt understood in what I was trying to get across. And that felt really good.
Wow, what a great story. That's a great story. And I think that's what I was saying. He said it better in broken French or broken English, than what I was literally just saying before this. That is a wonderful story. But I regret that we have to end now, and I usually finish with just one question. And it's one I ask everyone, and I have a lot of image makers and a lot of people that follow this show that actually make images and or are photographers or just people that make things, So if you could give anybody any advice, what would it be?
It's going to sound like a bit, I would say follow your heart and be curious and just do it. I think very often we get caught up in the outcome of what something should be and what it should become. But I think kind of trusting the process, but doing the work is very important. So yeah, do the work and try to be authentic, don't try and be someone else or something else. So I would say be authentic, do the work, follow your heart, and just keep making.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It was wonderful. I really, really enjoyed it. How can people connect with you? How can...
on Instagram. So Vanessa Cowling is my Instagram handle. That's probably a good place because that has constant updates. That's not as formal as a full body of work. That's a good place. And then obviously my website, vanessacowling.com, and then any other kind of contact information, you can find me via those platforms.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was wonderful. I wish we could talk longer. I think we have, I could probably talk to you for another hour if you wanted. Maybe I could have you back on. So yeah, you're like, no, I'm done. No,
it's terrible because it's like when you get started, there are like so many other things, it feels like, especially when you've been practicing for quite a long time, there are like lots of other interesting things, but I appreciate your time, Patrick. Of course. Thank you very much for having me.
Of course. And to all those that have made it this far, thank you so much for joining us on the Urbanaut Podcast. If you like content like this, please like, share, and comment down below. That all helps us with the algorithm. And as well as if you really, really like us, join our Patreon community. That's a way you can contribute to our show and help us continue to bring great guests to you. We are adding new content to it all the time. We have extended episodes where some of my conversations don't fit into our 2-hour window or hour-and-a-half window. We offer the full episode there to our subscribers. And we're offering new things there all the time. So consider becoming a Patreon member. And as always, we'll see you next time.